Podcast. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined, if you have any burning questions, comments, concerns, or even want to leave a tip or donation in the comments section, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features. They're an excellent way to interact with the show, get your opinions on the air, if you so choose. I always love this interactive environment that we are creating with this show. So, if you so choose, leave a comment in the comments section. I will get to them when I can. And let's make this show even bigger and better than it already is. Without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of today's show, talking about some either final additions to your roster or just high-risk, high-reward players that might be fun to put into your fantasy football squad in any capacity for this week. And let's start off with the long shot one that many of you guys might be skeptical about. Let's talk about Malik Willis. This could potentially be his final game as the starter for the Green Bay Packers, as Jordan Love's timeline to return has grown shorter, and it could be by week 4 when they go up against the Vikings in their first divisional game of the year. So, against his former team, mind you, going back, knowing most of the players on that team, familiar with, maybe not the coaching staff, but maybe familiar with some of the coaching philosophies there. This just feels like a nothing to lose kind of game for Malik Willis. And yes, he's not going to have many passing yards. He might not even have many pass attempts. He only had 14 in that game against Indy. But this could be a game where Matt LaFleur lets caution go to the wind here. This could be a game where Matt LaFleur says, we have one win already in the situation, and whether we're 1-2 or 2-1, we're in a better spot than we think because Jordan Love's timeline is shorter. So why not allow Malik Willis, potentially his final start on our team, against his former team, ironically, just be let loose. And they have the receivers to do it if they want to. It's just all about Malik Willis playing timely football, complementary football, and most importantly, protecting the football when the offense is on the field. As much as I love seeing Josh Jacobs, the new addition to this running back room, break out, have good games, have a lot of touches, I think that this could be a surprising game for Malik Willis, where you see the true side of what Malik Willis could be and could have been had he stayed in Tennessee. So, it's just a fun little experiment. Maybe not a starter, but just to see, maybe in a deeper league, a 2 QB league, you can have him on your bench and he performs well. And maybe even if we hear news that perhaps the Jordan Love injury is worse than we thought in the coming weeks, then maybe Malik Willis could be an interesting contingency plan for the time being. But for now, he's just a fun, frisky player to mess around with in fantasy. And then let's talk about a guy who's already on a lot of people's radar, may still be on the waiver wire in some leagues, but is becoming more and more of an X factor for this Baltimore Ravens squad, and that is Isaiah Likely. I think that over the past few weeks, we've seen two sides of the Ravens. One where the passing game looks very limited, and one where Lamar Jackson is starting to trust certain targets. And one of those targets is Isaiah Likely. And the reason why I think that Lamar Jackson is trusting Isaiah Likely is because he's someone who plays the tight end position in many different ways. He doesn't play necessarily as just a tight end, as someone who either blocks or runs seam routes all the time. He plays it in a way to help his quarterback. And I think that's what Lamar Jackson wants, because with this offensive line that's kind of struggling a little bit, whether it be the struggles of Patrick McCarry, whether it be some of the injuries along the line, it has been one of the weaknesses that we've seen in these two games for this Baltimore Ravens offense. And to mitigate for it, you need a reliable X-factor kind of target. And for Lamar, surprisingly, it's been Isaiah Likely. Now, obviously, Mark Andrews doesn't look like himself early on in the season. He is recovering from an injury sustained last season. But at the end of the day, I still think right now, at this current moment in time, Isaiah Likely looks like the more comfortable of the two in this system. And he's kind of like the scapegoat security blanket of this offense right now. So it means a ton more targets a ton more yardage for Isaiah Likely. So no matter what league you're in, especially maybe in a PPR league where targets are at a premium, Isaiah Likely could be the guy for you going forward. Another guy who's going to be even more and more of an X factor in his respective team is Marvin Harrison Jr. Really had a breakout game against LA last week, and I think that he's just going to continue to grow in this system. I think him and Kyler are finally over the hump in terms of working things out together, and so they're going to settle into a rapport together as QB and wide receiver one. And there was a little bit of worry about Kyler commenting on whether or not he's responsible for getting Marvin Harrison Jr. targets, and I don't think he really is. I think it comes naturally. The flow of this Arizona Cardinals offense is the most important thing about it. If they're not connecting early enough, then so be it. It just matters that this Arizona Cardinals offense really gels together, and it really is the first couple of games. They hung tough with a tough Buffalo Bills team on the road, and they beat up on the LA Rams. Yes, it was a team that was heavily depleted, without a lot of its weapons, which we'll talk about later, but it's still the LA Rams. It's still a divisional game, which we expect to be competitive, and Marvin Harrison Jr. showed up and showed out in that game. So, no matter what you hear from the media, no matter what rumors you hear about the disconnect between certain players on that team, I think everything will be just fine. And through 2 weeks so far, everything seems to have clicked, no matter who's getting the ball in that Arizona Cardinals offense. So Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to get more fun to look at, going to be more involved in this Arizona Cardinals offensive system as the true wide receiver one that Kyler Murray wants and needs. And so, as the season progresses, you're going to worry less and less about him in your team. Now let's talk about a guy who a lot of you already might have on your roster, one of the best tight ends in the league, perhaps even the third best tight end in all of fantasy football, Dalton Kincaid. Now, this offense really is starting to get a little bit less Allen-centric and playing it a little bit safer, right? We see a lot of more big games out of James Cook in recent games, and we've seen a lot more short passes. We haven't seen Josh Allen really get vertical just yet in this offense. And so, the reason why I think Dalton Kincaid can be a big X factor here is if there's a game when a certain defense is generating more pressure than they expected, then Josh Allen will have a nice scapegoat in Dalton Kincaid. I love the routes that Dalton Kincaid runs. Very well versed for such a young player. And in this Bills system, eventually you're going to have to find short yardage plays that can generate you enough yards to keep you on schedule. That's the basic tenets of this Buffalo Bills offense. Setting a tempo, keeping a rhythm, keeping on schedule. And I think Dalton Kincaid perfectly embodies every single trait of that kind of offense. So Dalton Kincaid is always going to be a sneaky good weapon of the tight end position for you. And then let's look at some players who might step up in terms of replacing players due to injury. Well, I can tell you right now, kind of foreshadowing to a future segment, that this guy may not have as big a role this week, but Brandon Powell, man. Let's talk about him a little bit. As I said, kind of foreshadowing, he might not have a bigger role, and you know what that means if you're a Vikings fan or just a fan of the league in general. But he is someone who is going to be very valuable for this Vikings team should, things go awry. And yes, I know that once everyone's healthy, he immediately falls down the pecking order. But over the past couple of years, he's shown that he's competent in certain areas of the field, very effective in the red zone especially. And I love him as a short yardage guy that can keep this team on schedule, especially against tougher teams when Sam Darnold will be facing more pressure. So look for Brandon Powell, even, as he drops down the pecking order, to be someone that Sam Darnold might like to have in the red zone as a kind of red zone threat against tougher opponents, much like what he was against San Fran this past week. But the last player that I want to touch on is actually a player who really needs to step up in crisis mode, and that is Jawan Jennings. We talked about Brandon Ayuk, as Pate mentioned, being in a bigger role in this game. How about Jawan Jennings, a guy who has really got under the radar for the San Francisco 49ers over the past couple of years, but really has been one of the most integral players in keeping them on schedule with this offense. Like, he's no slouch. Just because, he doesn't get as many targets as Debo, as Ayuk, as Kittle in this offense, he can move the chains. He's very savvy in terms of his route running abilities. And now that they're down to so many people, he immediately becomes someone whose intelligence can get this offense further than we expect down to many injuries, and really can keep Brock Purdy, who has shown that he struggles more without all of his pieces in place, on schedule. So the importance of, looking at teams that have depth to them and experience to them, most importantly, can really help you in terms of getting into the win column in fantasy football. But overall, let me know what you think about this list. I think in terms of trying to interpret all of these players who potentially be boom or bust, it's all down to, whether or not you feel they have longevity and whether or not you're well versed in the injuries. We're going to have a little segment later about all the injuries and updates around the league. But at the end of the day, just keep your mind on the waiver wire more than anything, because chances are you're going to find more and more gems, even in situations where, injury might happen or might not happen, or these players are just performing beyond what we thought of them. Like I mentioned, there are so many players outside of this list who could have been on it, but right now, these are my players. Let me know what you think about them in the comments. But coming up next, we're going to take a look at some of the most interesting games in the NFL this weekend in terms of fantasy implications, whether it be because of injury, whether it be because some fascinating fantasy matchups on offense and defense are taking place, or even just vintage rivalries. We'll be right back to talk about that right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it?